schedule in mind for Iowa and New Hampshire, yeah, and dates lined up and things to do. There's Dave Solomon.
Here I am.
Carly Fiorina.
Nice to meet you, Dave Solomon. Welcome to the Union Leader.
Thank you so much.
That's very
Great
nice.
to be here.
Nobody said that, Dave. That's good.
Are your laptop issues resolved?
I'm all set and ready to go.
Okay, there you go.
How much time, Anna, do we have?
So we have until 11.
Good.
That works for you guys.
That's great. If we don't use it all, maybe I could bring you around and introduce you to a few.
Oh, I'd love to.
Some of the people are interested in candidates. Some are interested in Donald Trump. But we'd like to introduce everybody. And what's Trump got against you?
You'd have to ask Mr. Trump.
Well, I have. And he tells me, failed executive.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
I'll run on my track record all day long. I was fired in a boardroom brawl, but I certainly didn't fail.
A lot of people
By
have been
every
fired.
number. That's right. A lot of people have been fired.
So you have said that in going up against the prospective Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, that you take away a big issue, that being female. How about the issue of wealth?
Well,
Or will that be one?
Bill and Hillary Clinton are worth a lot more money than Frank and Carly Fiorina, by a lot. So I think she's going to have a hard time banging away on anybody's wealth. The fact that they've made, $100 million in 10 years? I mean, I don't begrudge them that, but they're clearly in the top 1%, let's just say it that way.
Right. And you're not in the top 1%?
Oh, I probably am, but they're worth a lot more money than we are.
So somebody who's worked her way up from secretary to marketing to head of a company, et cetera, and has earned that wealth, how do common people relate to you? What kind of questions do they ask you?
Well, it's interesting. You're right. I started as a secretary. My husband, who earned part of our wealth, also started out as a tow truck driver in a family-owned auto body shop. So we've been very blessed by opportunity, but we've also worked really hard. And I think people don't begrudge other people's success. When we get to be a nation that resents success, that's a bad thing, as long as people have earned it. I don't begrudge Bill and Hillary Clinton their wealth, but I think it's worth asking the question. There's a big difference between earning money that shareholders vote on and earning speaking fees from foreign governments who have business in front of the Secretary of State who happens to be your wife. There's a big difference in that. And so I hope that people will continue to ask those questions. I'll tell you what, if I'm the nominee of our party, I will ask those questions on a general debate stage.
Now, to get to be the nominee, you have to win the majority of
That's
delegates.
right.
And you can't be in every state, but you're going to be in Iowa and New Hampshire. And we were talking just before Dave came in about Fox and how they were going to do the selection for the first Republican presidential debate, which I think is in August.
August 6th.
And they said, what day of the week is that?
It's a Thursday.
Oh, good. I like that.
Yeah,
Get
it's
it
like,
for
it's
Friday's
10 and a
Friday.
half weeks from today, sort of. Not that I'm counting.
And they said that they were going to take an average of 5 national polls. They didn't identify which polls, et cetera. And today, you wouldn't be in the top 10 of those. So do you do anything overt to move yourself up or to take paid advertising on Fox TV stations or something to get better known?
Well, first of all, of course, I'm glad they laid out what their criteria is so we know it. Polls are always lagging indicators. None of the national polls that we've looked at so far came since I've announced my candidacy. They're all before the announcement of my candidacy. And so what I'm going to do is continue to work hard. I'm going to continue to work hard and meet with the people of New Hampshire and the people of Iowa and do what I got to do and trust that the polls will move. But no, I'm not going to be taking out ads.
So you don't object to Fox's standards? Or how would you, based on how many people are in this thing and likely to get in it, how would you determine who should be on a stage in August for the first national look?
Well, see, maybe it's because I come from a world like you do, where results count. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about things I can't do anything about.
Yeah.
Fox News has announced their criteria.
Yeah.
I'm not going to change them. So now my job is to go work hard and meet those goals. They've laid out a set of goals. We understand them. I'm going to work hard and hope that I achieve those goals. And based on the progress that I think we're making so far and the momentum we're building, I think we'll be on that stage.
And the, again, it was before Dave came in, but last week, and the New York Times had a story on this as well, people were surprised, shocked, aghast at how you drew such a big crowd after a bunch of speeches among Republican candidates to talk to you in person. Did it surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me, because what people say to me when they listen to me is, you don't sound like a politician. I understand what you're saying. You answer my question. You're talking common sense. A gentleman came up to me today. I was over at Riviera University. He came up to me and said, "Carly, you said what I've been thinking." I think people know something's wrong. I think people are tired of politics as usual. I think people are looking for something different. And I think people know leadership when they see it. I really do.
Now, you said that you're not a politician. Some could say that you are a failed politician, since you ran for high office in California and were beaten. So what's the difference between somebody who runs for office and loses and says they're not a politician and somebody who gets into office?
Well, remember that lots of people lose before they win. Ronald Reagan lost before he won. Nixon lost before he won. Clinton lost before he won. Even Obama lost before he won.
Nixon didn't lose before he won.
Yeah, he did.
No,
Anyway, we
he
can go
won
back.
the U.S. House seat in 1948. That was his first election after the U.S. Navy Pacific.
Lost
but he
the governor's race
Yeah, he
against
lost the
Brown.
governor's race.
Yes, but he didn't lose. He didn't lose before he won. The first race he ran.
Oh, I
That was his
see.
first
Well, he
race.
lost before he won the presidency. Let's say that. Let's say that.
Okay.
So, of course, California was always going to be a heavy lift. You know, Democrats outnumber Republicans, et cetera. But interesting, year before that general election, I was bald because I just finished cancer treatment.
Yeah.
I was nowhere in the polls.
You
Nobody
weren't
gave
wearing
me.
a wig?
Nope.
Scarf?
Nope.
Scarf? No.
Nope. Go back and look at the pictures. I was
No, I
bald.
just thought you had an
And,
interest in this. Okay.
Everyone said it couldn't be done. I won the Republican primary, a three-way primary, with 57% of the vote. And yes, I lost the general, but I went on and won more Republican votes, more Democratic votes, more independent votes than virtually anyone anywhere in the nation in 2010. So I learned a lot in that race. I learned to appeal to Democrats and independents. I learned that a ground game matters. They have a ground game, and Republicans had none. And Hillary Clinton's going to have a good ground game.
You said something about the California drought recently, that it was in part a result of left-wing environmentalists or something?
Well, the drought isn't man-made. The drought comes from God, but the consequences of the drought are man-made. California has been suffering droughts for centuries. I mean, I can remember being in college at Stanford and us going through a drought this bad. But what liberal environmentalists have done is prevent the building of a single reservoir or a single water conveyance system in 40 years, while the population of the state has doubled. So let's think about it. We have droughts all the time. Our population is doubling. Let's not save any water. And so what happens is 70% of the rainfall washes out to sea year after year after year. So if you have a bad year, you got nothing to save. And then in 1996, roughly, those same liberal environmentalists said, now what we're going to do is we're going to cut off the water flow to agriculture because we're going to protect this fish called the smelt, even though the science was unclear. And so the consequence of all those policies is what? The devastation of the agriculture industry, the devastation of it. I've been in these towns, 40% unemployment, acres and acres and acres of just dust bowl. That is man-made, and people's lives and livelihoods have been destroyed, and nothing makes me angrier than when people's livelihoods are destroyed at the altar of ideology. And that's exactly what's gone on in California. And meanwhile, these same liberal environmentalists say, oh, you know what, we should build a high-speed train that nobody needs. Well, let's think about the environmental consequences of putting tracks through the desert. No, that's okay, because that's a technology they approve of. So now they're spending tens of billions of dollars to build a high-speed train from LA to Bakersfield, when you can fly on Southwest Airlines very inexpensively. So yes, the consequences of the drought in California are man-made.
I like it. Foreign policy, I wouldn't think would be your strong suit. You've been busy battling regulations in the United States and taxes, possibly the Federal Reserve and things like that. But why should anybody vote for you for president based on your foreign policy experience? Or?
Actually, I know more world leaders than anyone running, with the possible exception of Hillary Clinton, and I didn't do photo ops. I chaired the advisory board at the Central Intelligence Agency. I've advised the NSA. I've advised 2 secretaries of defense, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Homeland Security. I've sat this close to Vladimir Putin, Bibi Netanyahu, the Chinese leadership, the Saudi leadership, the Emiratis, the Qataris. I've known King Abdullah for 15 years. I know President Lula and his successor. I know African presidents. I know a lot of people. And I've been in the world a long time, not just on business, but on charity as well. So when you sit this close to Vladimir Putin and you talk to him about substantive issues, not with cameras.
Was he wearing a shirt?
Yeah, he was wearing a shirt. He looked very natty. By the way, he's a very intelligent man, very charming man, very funny man when he wants to be.
Aide to the mayor of Leningrad.
Well, Vladimir Putin will not stop his quest for power, which is what this is. He's actually, it's not about ideology for him, it's about power. Political power, economic power, military power, territorial power. He won't stop unless he senses resolve on the other side, not a red reset button.
So how does President Fiorina build resolve that
You know what I would
senses?
do? By the way, the other thing that I think President Obama has done is he constantly presents a false choice. The false choice is, if you don't agree with what I'm doing or not doing, there's nothing we can do but go to war.
Right.
And he's said that about Russia over and over. Totally untrue. I would do 4 things immediately, all of which are within our control. Rebuild the 6th Fleet. Rebuild the missile defense program. Conduct regular, aggressive military exercises in the Baltic states and arm the Ukrainians. I would do every one of those things. Every one of them would send a clear message, and we don't need anyone's permission to do any of them.
By how much does the U.S. Defense Department budget go up or down in a Fiorina administration?
Well,
in
it
the first
depends.
4 years?
It depends. And here's what it depends on. One of the reasons I'm pushing for zero-based budgeting, which we can come back to, is because we have no idea how our money is being spent. Zero. And unless you know where the money is being spent, you can't prioritize. But why do I say it depends? In the Department of Defense, there's something called the tooth-to-tail ratio. Tooth, fighting men and women, tip of the spear, support. Tail, bureaucracy. The tooth-to-tail ratios in the Pentagon have been as bad as they've ever been, which means we're not investing enough in tooth, and we got way too much tail, way too much bureaucracy. So we have to have the strongest military on the face of the planet, and everybody has to know it. So we have to invest more in tooth. But all this tail back here, this bureaucracy, these civilian contractors. So we have to invest more in this and reform the tail.
Example of something in the tail that President Fiorina would chop.
Well, there are, I've lost track now, and part of this Congress is responsible for as well, which is why you have to engage the American people in a lot of these conversations. There are probably, I'm not exaggerating, 60 plus different processes that a budget has to go through. So what does that create? Vast bureaucracy. I mean, just people spinning through paperwork and processes. Does it produce anything? Not a thing. It just produces binders of paper. It's all bureaucratic crush, but it all costs money. So you have to simplify that process. It's true throughout government, by the way.
You mentioned working with the NSA and the CIA and others. And NSA's segue to Drew, who usually wants to know about NSA and Patriot Act.
Well, it's good timing this week, right? So Rand Paul gives his filibuster on Patriot Act, says the data collection programs are illegal and unconstitutional, and on the other end, Marco Rubio says everything they're doing 100% is perfectly okay and there's nothing to worry about. So where do you fall on that spectrum?
Then there's another alternative, which Ted Cruz and others are pushing forward, which says let the telephone companies do what the government's been doing. So the first point I would make is this is why people are tired of politics as usual. How long has Congress known that the Patriot Act was coming up? Why is everything last minute? Why is everything a rush because we haven't had a chance to think about it? This isn't news that this was coming up for reauthorization. We've known this for how long?
4 years.
Exactly, 4 years, and yet somehow there's no plan. It frustrates people. This isn't how you operate in the real world. Secondly, I don't think it helps to have telephone companies do precisely what the NSA has been doing. I don't see that that helps anything. Third, I think it would be useful, and I said this as I advised the CIA as well, without revealing sources and methods, the only way the American people can support any covert program is to understand as much of it as possible. And so I think it would be hugely helpful if the intelligence community would come out and speak in as transparent a way as possible about why they think Section 215 is necessary. Because the truth is, there's a lot of controversy about whether it's necessary at all. Has it actually helped prevent a terrorist attack? How is that information used? There's been no explanation of why we actually need it. And so what we've got right now, honestly, is a lot of grandstanding on some people's parts, and yet we don't have a solution, and we've had 4 years to work on one. 4 years to work on one.
Where do you fall on the idea of the power, where that power should lie with the NSA? Is this a constitutional program? Is it not?
First of all, I think that it's vital that Congress have an oversight role to ensure that whatever the NSA is doing is constitutional. Clearly, there are very mixed views on whether it's constitutional or not, which is why I think it's incumbent upon the intelligence community to step forward and provide their rationale. Why is it necessary, and why, in their judgment, is it constitutional? I haven't heard that from anybody, and I think it's a disservice to people who are trying to work hard.
They've given testimony making those points as why they feel like it's necessary, and it's prevented X number of terrorist attacks. And I mean, they've done this before Congress several times.
Yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, what I think they've done is the same thing lots of politicians do. What they've done is provide sound bites. Yes, it's necessary. It's prevented attacks. Yes, it's constitutional. I think the American people are very torn on this issue because that's not been a particularly compelling explanation. So let's hear it. By the way, I made the same criticism of President Obama and Trade Promotion Authority. I support free trade, but I've also said, tell us what's in this agreement. The more transparency there is, the more people can make reasonable judgments. And when you're just getting some soundbite at 50,000 feet, then people can argue forever, and we don't really have a lot of transparency about what's going on.
Just following up on Drew's question, do you think it's constitutional or not, or do you not know enough about it?
I am not comfortable with warrantless wiretaps. I'm not, just as an example, and I'm not comfortable with the argument that we just don't have time to go to a judge, because the truth is, analyzing the masses of bulk data that are collected takes a lot of time. And so those arguments don't ring true for me, which is why I'd like a more fulsome explanation. And if I had nothing more than what I have right now, I would insist, I think, on putting a judge in the middle of that process. I don't think sending it to the telephone companies accomplishes much of anything. I also think that the American people are being, I don't want to say, I want to choose my words carefully here. People do not understand fully how much data on them is collected by Google, Facebook, Twitter. So I think people are being ginned up for this argument by some politicians. Oh, this is a terrible thing, all this information that the government is collecting, when in truth, commercial companies are collecting far more revealing data about people than the government is, and using that data for commercial purposes.
Isn't there a difference between you signing up for Google and signing a disclosure agreement that says, I know what's, I realize that you're collecting some information on me for marketing purposes, and having the government secretly collect the government, which can do more with that information than Google can, collecting data that is without your consent?
Yes, there is a difference, which is why transparency on the government's part is critical, absolutely critical. There is a difference. And so that's why I say the NSA, the CIA have to be as forthcoming as they can be so that there is support for these covert programs. On the other hand, it is also true that the government collects less data, time, phone number. That's less data than the very personally revealing data that's collected by commercial companies. And I think not everyone understands what's in their disclosure form. And most of these companies, I'm not criticizing these companies, but the truth is those are opt-out policies, not opt-in policies.
I was at a conference and they were talking about this data, and they said that it was a campaign conference, and they said that every campaign will have access to 1,000 points of data about every person, including whether or not you bought diapers, whether you bought baby formula, all this, whether you've been on a cruise, where you've flown, and this was all that opt-out stuff. So do you think that the government should have more oversight about that? Do you think there should be legislation? Because they said right now there's really nothing. It's sort of the wild, wild west.
Well, it's interesting you use that phrase because I have used that phrase a lot in describing the internet. It can't be a wild, wild west. A long time ago, you can go back and look it up if you'd like, but a long time ago I testified in front of Congress, and I said that Congress should never legislate the ceiling because that leads to hugely complicated regulations that just crush the entrepreneurial spirit in this nation, which is what's happening to us today. But Congress should and can legislate the floor. And what I mean by that is, what is the minimal acceptable disclosure that a company has to provide to its customers so that its customers fully understand and have an opportunity to opt in or opt out of that data collection? I think that is important. And obviously there are big interests that don't want that to happen. I find it equally disturbing that these big companies have worked with this administration and the FCC under the guise of net neutrality and put out 400 pages of regulation over the internet, which is a big bureaucratic morass. It won't help anything, and it doesn't address these basic issues.
Carly, you were talking about how you got started as a secretary and your husband is a tow truck driver.
Yeah.
You think that the condition in the workplace and the economy in general still allows for anybody who is willing to really work hard and play by the rules to achieve prosperity? Or do you think we're in a situation where even if you work hard, play by the rules, given wage stagnation and other factors in the economy, it is not an assurance of prosperity as it once was?
The latter. That's why I'm running for president.
And why so?
Americans don't have the same possibilities they once had. And when I talk to voters, I say all the time, there is deep disquiet in this nation. It's not partisan. It's not political. People fear we are losing the sense of limitless possibility that has always defined this nation in people's lives. And they're right. They're right. So if you look at what's going on in the economy, really look at it. We are crushing the economic engine of this nation. What is that economic engine? It's not big companies. It's little companies. 9-person real estate firm that I started in. A family-owned auto body shop my husband started in. The lawn care company, the corner coffee shop, the dry cleaner, the nail salon. It's those little companies that employ half the people. They create 2/3 of the new jobs. They innovate at faster rates than big companies. And what's happened, we're now destroying more businesses than we're creating. For the first time in U.S. history. This is a big deal. Our government has gotten so big, so powerful, so costly, so complicated, so inept in many cases. The VA is inept, so corrupt in some cases, that only the big and the powerful and the wealthy and the well-connected can handle it. So you just see it over and over. If you have a 70,000-page tax code, that's what we have today, 70,000 pages. Last time I was in New Hampshire, I had 4 business owners in 2 days come up to me and say, you know what, I couldn't finish my taxes. I don't understand them. I can't get anybody at the IRS to answer my phone call. But if you're a big company, I ran a $90 billion business. By the time I was done at Hewlett-Packard, it was a $90 billion business. We could handle complexity. We could handle it. You know, I could hire some more accountants, hire more lawyers, hire more lobbyists. The big get bigger with big government. The wealthy get wealthier with big government. Because all those loopholes we have in that 70,000-page tax code, they advantage the rich. They don't advantage the middle class or the poor. So to level the playing field, we have to simplify dramatically. And what you have is a political class, Republicans and Democrats alike, sadly, who have managed within the system for so long. They've just managed within the status quo. We have to change the system now. And simplification is the only way to level the playing field. By the way, in one of those Fox News polls, the reason I say this isn't political, it's interesting. In the last national Fox News poll that I saw, 82% of the American people, so that's certainly not partisan, 82% of the American people said, basically, there's a professional political class, and it's operating against our interests. They see it. They see, I'll digress for a moment, but I'm always reminded of this woman I met as chair of one of the charities, Good 360, that I'm chairman of. I was in a homeless woman's shelter in New York City. This was maybe in February. And we're distributing clothes and shoes. This woman, fascinating story, she's from Mississippi. She's 38 years old. One day she decides her life is going nowhere in Mississippi. She gets on a bus and she goes to New York City. And she's there in a homeless woman's shelter. And we're talking, I'm hearing about her story, you know, and she says, you're somebody. I've seen you on TV or something. So I said, well, you know, I'm Carly Fiorina, maybe I'm going to run for office. She says, you know, those politicians up here, they talk to themselves, they do all this work. They don't care about what's going on with us down here, except whatever they do up here, it lands on us down there. It's a pretty cogent explanation of the disconnect people feel between their government in Washington and their lives. And all that's going on up there is crushing people down here. That's a fact.
There's some news today that the president wants to spend $2 billion to set up a network of, to allow states to create paid family leave. Do you think that that's something the government should be involved in, or do you think that should be up to private industry?
Well, first, how typical of this president, honestly, how typical. Let's come up with a grand gesture that doesn't have a prayer of happening. But let's come up with yet another grand gesture to distract people. He's come up with grand gestures like free community college, $2 billion here, $2 billion there. I mentioned zero-based budgeting. We have to be able to prioritize what the federal government spends, and you cannot prioritize money if you have no idea how our money is being spent. We have no idea, zero idea. So we have to see how our money is being spent. But really, the federal government needs to get its own house in order before it starts telling the private sector what to do. Example, you can watch pornography all day long in the federal government and earn the same pay, pension, benefits, and leave as somebody trying to do a good job. We get an Inspector General's report about that every 3 months. It's just gone on and on and on. Why don't we stop that? Why don't we actually fire people who don't do their job? Remember when the VA scandal broke and they passed this bill that the 400 senior executives can be fired? Good idea. We ought to do it throughout the whole government. Guess how many people have been fired as the scandals go on and on? One. I mean, why doesn't the federal government get its house in order? Pay for performance. Zero-based budgeting. If you watch pornography all day long, you're going to get fired. You're not going to get your pay and your pension. You would get fired in the private sector. You'd get fired at the union leader, I'm quite certain. Why don't we... And yet that goes on and on and on in the federal government. So let's let the federal government lead by example, which will require leadership in the White House, instead of allowing this mess and this morass to go on and lecturing everybody else. Remember when President Obama, the reason I call it a gesture, he had a big photo op in the White House with all of his cabinet secretaries, and he said, we're going to save money. And then a couple months later, he reported out that they'd found $100 million of savings. And yet in the last 6 years, Senator Tom Coburn has released a report every year in excruciating detail that lays out hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud, waste, abuse, corruption, and nothing's happened. Nothing.
So you're against paid family leave?
No, do not put words in my mouth. I am for the federal government getting its own house in order before it goes out and tells the private sector what to do.
So let's say the government were to do that under a Fiorina administration. Would you then be for paid family?
I don't answer hypotheticals. But what I will tell you as the CEO of Hewlett-Packard is we provided paid family leave to mothers and fathers. Most companies who have to work hard to attract employees provide a robust set of benefits because benefits are part of the package that they use to attract employees to hire for them.
I guess what I'm trying to ask is just more philosophically, do you think that that's more of the role of the government or more of the role of the business to...
I do not think it is the role of a vast, bloated, incompetent bureaucracy to tell the private sector how to do its job, particularly because the private sector, what's a fundamental difference between the private sector and government? It's not that there aren't bad businesses. There are bad businesses, and there, of course, should be some rules and regulations. But the fundamental difference between the private sector and the government is what? The private sector, you are accountable. You're accountable to your customers. You're accountable to your investors. You're accountable to your employees.
Unless you're a big bank.
Well, yes, but how did that happen? How did that, let's come back, hold that thought, because how did that happen? You're accountable, and by the way, your customers have choices. They have choices. If you look at the government, citizens have no choices. There isn't some other government they can appeal to, and the government isn't accountable. They're not accountable. All these terrible things come out about the government, and what happens? Nothing. So that's the fundamental difference. Let's hold the government accountable. Let's understand where the money is being spent. Let's make sure that we clean up our own house in government before we tell businesses that are operating day in and day out and being held to account before we start lecturing them. So how did the banks become unaccountable? It's a classic case. What started the financial crisis? Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, supported by both Republicans and Democrats alike, right? So let's have these big entities use basically government-insured money to push home ownership. When politics gets involved in markets, it's a very bad thing. And when the crash happens, we had basically 25 regulatory agencies that were supposed to be overseeing the system. They weren't. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Do we reform any of the 25? No. Do we reform Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? No. We create another big big bureaucracy called the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau. We passed Dodd-Frank. 10 banks too big to fail, or what now? 5 banks, even bigger, still too big to fail. No reform. Meanwhile, 3,000 community banks have gone out of business. Because those 3,000 community banks, they're not big enough to handle the complexity. The big banks had to consolidate to deal with all of this. If you listen to Jamie Dimon, you'll hear him say he is now spending billions in compliance. So guess what? If you're a community bank, you don't have those kinds of resources. So the point is, when government gets bigger, when government gets more complicated, when government gets more powerful, then only the big, the powerful, the wealthy, the well-connected can deal with it. It's called crony capitalism. It's alive and well, except that when somebody like Elizabeth Warren says the answer to crony capitalism is more big government, she belies the fact that she doesn't understand how the economy works at all. Government gets bigger, only the big survive.
Which department of government would you excise completely?
I wouldn't start there. I wouldn't start there. I would start with zero-based budgeting. I would want to know where we're spending money in every single department. Actually, where I would start with first is let's go deal with the hundreds of billions of fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption that we already know are there. But I think there are 3 things that have to happen before let's just eliminate a department, which frankly I think is a political gesture. 3 things have to happen. Actually, 4. Well, he didn't eliminate any. He didn't eliminate any. In fact, several got bigger under his. I think we have to.
So the Department of Education you would retain?
I would start here. I would start with zero-based budgeting so we know where our money is being spent. I would go to pay for performance. We could get the American people to help on both of those. We can come back to that if you'd like. I would tackle the hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption that we know are there. We know where it is. It's in excruciating detail. Let's go deal with that. And finally, 4th, we have a great opportunity in front of us.
I don't understand how you can say repeatedly that we don't know where our money is being spent.
We don't.
But you know where the fraud and waste is.
I don't. Senator Tom Coburn puts out reports every single year.
You said there were hundreds
GAO.
of millions of
That's
fraud
right.
and waste in the government.
That's right, there are.
Right?
Yeah.
We don't know where our money's spent, but we know there's fraud and waste.
Yeah. So
Because
the
Coburn put out a report. What's in the report?
So what Tom Coburn has done every year, along
I know
with
he's done
the
it every year,
GAO,
but specifically, what has he suggested was fraud and waste?
So the reason I start there instead of let's eliminate a whole department is in every single department, there's waste. Let's just take that. When you have, let's just pick one, 16 different food programs, you're going to have waste. That's what we have today. We have 1/3 of the nation on some kind of government-provided food program. 1/3 of the nation now.
So you would eliminate some of those 16 programs?
Yes, absolutely I would. I would consolidate them. Absolutely I would. 16 programs. We have 25 different visa programs. Why do we have people who come to this country on a legal visa overstayed and just get to stay here forever? Because if you have 25 different visa programs, you can't manage that. It's a example of the complexity.
Carly, you were on your way to 4 things, and I lost you there. Zero-based
The
budgeting.
The 4th thing would be
pay for performance and fraud, waste, and
let's
corruption.
go tackle what's in the reports. The 4th thing is this. In the next 5 to 6 years, we're going to have tens of thousands of baby boomers retire out of the federal government. We can say, as a design principle, and I would, we're not going to replace a single one of those jobs. Or we can just let things go on as they've always gone on, and every single one of those jobs will just get replaced, whether we need to replace them or not, and then we'll have another 25 years to wait. It's an opportunity to reduce the size of government because we know these people are going to retire, but you can't use that opportunity unless you know where your money's being spent, unless you start to root out some of this stuff, and unless you reimagine government and the role it's supposed to play. Example, when I say reimagine, just to explain that word, the VA, I talked about the VA. It's a shambles. It's a shambles, and it has been that way for 25 years. I literally would take 10 25-year-old veterans I picked 25 because they understand technology. And I would put them in a room, and I would ask them, as you ask a customer, because citizens should be thought of as the customers of government. They certainly pay for the government. How do you want to be served? Tell us how you want to be served. And they would give us a blueprint that's better and different than the bureaucrats in the VA are ever going to think about. Because the bureaucrats in the VA, it's not that they're bad people, it's that bureaucracies work a certain way. And the way they work is people protect their turf. They protect their turf. And they follow the rules. And so there isn't an opportunity to reimagine it.
Would you imagine a veteran would rather go to a private hospital with funding or a Veterans Administration hospital? Which would you think the average veteran would prefer?
I don't know, which is why we have to ask them. But my
Well, I've asked
my
veterans,
guess
and
is,
veterans know they want the VA.
well, but they don't want to sit. It depends on, I think, I've talked with many as well, I think it depends on what the issue is. If it's and it may depend on the veteran, but you know, when you're a veteran and you walk into a waiting room, as a New Hampshire veteran said to me, he said, when I walk into the waiting room and there are 200 people, I'm discouraged. And you can understand that. I would be too.
I don't know where in New Hampshire you would walk into a waiting room with 200 people.
The Elliott on Saturday night. But
I'm just telling you what he said to me.
He's not likely to, well, that's a private hospital, but the interesting thing about the veterans is they want to be treated as veterans with the veterans hospital and veterans facilities, and their complaint is waste, fraud,
Yeah.
long lines, but not with the treatment that they get at Veterans Hospital.
That's reassuring. That's why you ask the veterans how you want to be served. Instead of telling them how they ought to be served, that's why you ask them, how do you want to be served? How do you want to be served? But you know, when the look, this is the age of technology. We can do anything on a smartphone. It's ridiculous that veterans have to spend months filling out paperwork, and many more months while a bureaucrat checks their paperwork, and many more months while a bureaucrat decides whether they get an appointment or not. I mean, the regional headquarters of the VA in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, has had to have the foundations of the building reinforced because of the weight of the paperwork on the bureaucrat's desk. That's a true story. That's a statement.
That sounds like a Reagan story.
But it's a true
We're
story.
going to scope that one.
It's a true story.
They've had to reinforce
Their foundations
The
because of the
foundation.
weight of the paperwork on the bureaucrat's desk. That
how-
doesn't happen over a month or two.
How was this reached, this conclusion?
It was publicized.
What,
They had to
what
do
facility
this.
is this again?
Winston-Salem.
VA in Winston-Salem?
You've outlined a managerial approach to
It's a
shrinking.
leadership approach. Managers operate within the status quo.
But it's a managerial approach in the sense that it's all about managing the bureaucracy. But what we haven't heard is an ideological approach to look at the bureaucracy, to look at the federal government, to look at the agencies and departments and say, philosophically, I don't think the government ought to do that. So where are some things that you look at Washington and you say, Washington just ought to be doing this?
So philosophically, smaller is always better, and decentralized decision-making always works better. That's why our founders got it right. I mean, the closer you have a decision to the person impacted by the decision, the better that decision is going to be, the more accountable that decision is going to be. So everything possible ought to be moved out of Washington and into the states or the communities. Everything possible. Let's take a couple examples. Obamacare. The government, the federal government, should not be regulating the health insurance industry. We ought to have states managing high-risk pools, and we ought to try the one thing in health insurance we've never tried. We have never tried a free market, ever. The health insurance industry has been a regulated oligopoly for a century. And by the way, the health insurance companies like that. You know, they got together with their state regulators, 2 or 3 or 4, and they kind of made the rules. And all we've done is raise that up to a federally regulated oligopoly. And it's not serving people. So that would be an example. Here's another example. Common Core is a bad idea. It's a bad idea because The Department of Education has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger for 40 years, and the quality of education hasn't improved. But what's Common Core? However it started, however it was intended, what it is now is a bureaucratic program coming out of Washington, D.C. that is trying to standardize, because that's what bureaucracies do, they standardize. It's trying to standardize how teachers teach and how students learn. It's a bad idea. Federal government shouldn't be involved in that whatsoever.
I thought Common Core was requested by businesses who thought that the workforce was failing in things that the businesses needed them to do. And that's why they went to the governors like Bush in Florida and other places and asked for this cohesiveness so that kids taught in one state would be taught essentially the same things in another state.
It wouldn't be what I would ever ask for as a business person. So that may be what people are saying about how Common Core started. That may be the view of some business people. But
have you taken the Common Core test?
I have seen the Common Core test.
Have you taken it?
No, I haven't taken it.
This guy took it. Mr. Solomon.
No, I didn't.
Oh, you just wrote the story.
Right.
We had two other of our
Two other staff members took it.
Take it, yeah.
They did. They
Yeah,
found it very
the
challenging.
rationale that you lay out doesn't make a lot of sense to me, frankly. Maybe that's what some people said, but businesses certainly want a K through 12 education system that works, and they certainly want workers prepared. But the truth is, the more opportunity there is for business to operate with locally with, say, community colleges and others to try and tailor education for what they're trying to do, the better off it is. That's what you see happening in places. I happen to have written my thesis on this at MIT. But so it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. But if you look at states that have been very, very successful at attracting new businesses to them, what you'll find is a very tight partnership between business and the local community colleges and local K through 12 to get workers prepared for the particular jobs.
The big push now by some quarters is universal pre-K learning funded by the government. That both parents, if there are two parents, are working and they can't take care of their kids. So from ages 2 and up, they should be in federally or state-funded daycares.
I have no difficulty with saying that parents need help paying for education choices for their kids. I have no trouble with that. In fact, I think we should be giving parents the maximum number of choices as to how to educate their children. And if that means vouchers and charters and tax rebates, whether it's pre-K all the way through 12, I'm for that. However, there's a big difference between that and the federal government mandating that every child must go to preschool. My granddaughters didn't go to preschool because they had a mom at home who wanted to care for them during that period. Do I want the federal government saying that's not okay? Do I want the federal government saying it's not a reasonable option that a parent can homeschool their child? No, I do not want the federal government saying that.
Well,
Help
I don't think
a
the federal
parent with
government says
choices.
that now.
Well, President Obama would like to mandate pre-K education. That's a different thing than supporting parents so that they have the maximum number of choices. It's very different to say, let's give you vouchers, let's give you tax credits, let's support you so that you have the maximum number of choices in what your child's education will be. That's different than saying the federal government is going to mandate that you put your child in pre-K education, or mandate that you don't get a charter school, which is what some liberals would like to do, like Bill de Blasio in New York, for example.
Wrap it up with a question.
So, Iraq is falling into chaos right now. ISIS is on the march.
It is in chaos.
Not looking backward, but looking forward. What does the next president have to do there, and what would be your approach?
So the first thing that the next president has to do there is rebuild the alliances with our Arab partners who know this is their fight, specifically. And I know all these people. King Abdullah of Jordan. I have not met the current president of Egypt. King Abdullah of Jordan was in this country when the Jordanian pilot was burned alive. He was here asking for bombs and material. He still has not received them from our government. And he now, the word is going to China. He knows ISIS is his fight, but he is expecting support and leadership from us. We're not providing it. The Kurds, the best fighting force in the Middle East. We should have armed them 3 years ago. We continue this fiction that, oh, no, the arms have to go through the central government in Baghdad. There is no central government in Baghdad. There is a government in Baghdad which is now aligned with the government of Iran. We should be arming the Kurds directly. The Egyptians have asked us to share intelligence. We are not. The Qataris, the Emiratis, the Turks, outside of the Middle East, obviously, the Turks have asked us for help and support. Instead of having a Camp David summit to try and talk all these people into a bad deal with Iran, I would have a Camp David summit to gather our allies in the Arab Middle East and say, what is it that we can do to support you in this fight? They know it's their fight. President Sisi, a pious Muslim, a very brave man, his life is in danger every day right now in Egypt. What does he do when 21 Coptic Christians are burned alive in Egypt? He starts bombing, but more importantly even, he goes to Cairo, he addresses the 5 most powerful imams in Cairo, and he says to them, there is a cancer in the heart of Islam, and only we Muslims can root it out. He is right, and we need to be standing with him and supporting him, but we're not. Our president, what does President Obama do after President Sisi does that? President Obama literally says, I neither condemn nor condone his actions. Really? So, we should rebuild that alliance. We also should push back against Iran. I mean, 5 years ago, I sat in Bibi Netanyahu's office. There wasn't a photo op. It was my husband Frank, me, Bibi Netanyahu. And Bibi Netanyahu 5 years ago wanted to talk about Iran. And then I walked down the hall and I talked to the head of Mossad. He wanted to talk about Iran. And this administration continues to talk. We have a bad deal. Iran's intentions are very clear. So James Mattis, who commanded forces in the Middle East from 2010 to 2013, he gave this administration very specific recommendations about how to work with our Arab allies to push back against Iran's proxies. We've done none of it. He was retired. We ought to stop talking to Iran. We ought to insist that they open up their nuclear facilities to full inspections, and until they do that, we should put maximum pressure on them through the financial system, which we can do. We can make it very hard for them to move money around the financial system, but we're not. And so what's going on right now, unfortunately, in the Middle East is all of the people who stood with us are sitting there saying, America doesn't stand with its allies. Even Saudi Arabia, who isn't particularly a friend of Israel, but Saudi Arabia pays attention when we treat Israel the way we're treating Israel. The Saudis, remember when they started bombing in Yemen? They gave us 30 minutes notice. That means they don't trust us anymore. The King of Saudi Arabia doesn't show up at this summit. He talks in the past tense about how we were strong allies. The Saudis don't trust us anymore. That's a terrible thing. So we have to rebuild that alliance. We have to support them while they fight ISIS. They know it's their fight. And we have to push back against Iran because Iran is a huge threat, not just to the region. They are a threat to the world. They want a nuclear weapon, period, end of story.
Isn't North Korea a threat?
Yes, absolutely they are.
So we put sanctions on North Korea, they still build the nuclear devices.
That's true. Absolutely right.
So isn't it better, as Obama says, to get some deal with Iran that postpones that while you continue to work with them?
You know, it would be good if we had a deal we could count on. But I haven't negotiated a nuclear deal, but I've negotiated a lot of deals. And there are some cardinal rules of good deal making. You know what they are. Number one, know what your goals are, and don't sign a deal until you've achieved your goals. So President Obama laid out very specific goals. Not one of them has been achieved. We don't have a single nuclear facility that's being dismantled. Not one of the 19,000 centrifuges will stop spinning. They used to agree that they'd ship their enriched uranium out of the country. Nope, now they're going to keep it here. So we haven't achieved a single goal. Number two, walk away from the table. Sometimes you have to walk away from the table. We've never walked away from the table. And while Iran is continuing to push bad behavior all throughout the region. Iran has a very specific strategy to destabilize the region. They're using their proxies to do it. No matter what they do, we keep talking. And rule number 3, don't celebrate till you have the deal you want. So when this president goes into the Rose Garden and celebrates a historic framework agreement when we don't even have a deal yet, what do the Iranians conclude? We got him. He's committed publicly. And so they then immediately started negotiating for an even better deal, which is what they're doing now. So yeah, we're going to have a deal at the end of it. But is it a deal that's going to slow their march to a nuclear weapon? I do not think so. And we'll have no way of knowing, by the way, because they've stated that they won't permit inspections. And they've also stated that the sanctions need to come off right away. So we'll have no way of knowing what they're doing. And this talk about snapping back the sanctions, it's ridiculous. The sanctions regime is over. We have Russia, shipping in weapons. We have, by the way, Russia and China have never been on our side of the table. Never. Such a shock, isn't it? Isn't it? P5+1, they're not negotiating for us, they're negotiating for them. They want Iran's economy open.
Shocked. Okay. I want to get you around the building real quick.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
time.
I'm sure you have a busy schedule here in Hampshire today.
Well, every day is busy right now.
What are some of your other stops?
I'm doing the Dairy GOP luncheon today, and then I'm going to a house party later in this evening.
Great. Okay.
Bedford, yeah,
Okay.
Bedford.
Excellent.
Have a good time. You'll meet
Thank
a
you,
lot
and
of
I was
voters.
here today. Thank you.
Sure will.
Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you for your time.